Hi, friend. Thanks for visiting my channel. First time here? Please hit subscribe and share this with someone. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave a comment. Let's begin. Bennett found peace in predictability. Each day began at the same time, with a freshly brewed cup of coffee, the news murmuring in the background as he got dressed, and a methodical glance at his schedule before heading out the door. These repeated motions, familiar and rhythmic, were like the quiet refrain of a song he never tired of. For almost a decade, he had shared this pattern with Kira. Though they had never signed any papers, their lives reflected all the hallmarks of a marriage. Bennett managed the bills without delay, washed the car every Saturday morning, and endured classic movies he didn't particularly enjoy, simply because they made her happy. For him, devotion lived in the form of consistency. He wasn't one for grand gestures or flowery words, but his presence was constant. Kira, on the other hand, was change incarnate. She hopped from one job to another as soon as monotony crept in, transformed her hair on sudden impulses, and often chased new beginnings before the last chapter had closed. Bennett wasn't bothered. He saw her volatility as a compliment to his steadiness. She stirred things up, while he grounded them. That Tuesday evening, she casually mentioned plans to meet up with Sophie, her closest friend. Bennett was at the kitchen table, eating a meal of rice, meat, and vegetables he'd prepared earlier. Kira stepped out from the bedroom wearing a tight red dress and heels. He lifted his head and gave a faint smile. "Got plans tonight?" he asked, though he already knew the reply. Kira laughed and told him it was just dinner with a coworker. She kissed him on the forehead, slung her bag over her shoulder, and rushed out the door. He stayed at the table, finishing his food at a relaxed pace. After cleaning up and wiping the counters, he decided to stroll over to a quiet little diner near his workplace, the kind of place where the staff didn't need to take his order anymore. Apple pie and coffee were a given. As he sat waiting, he spotted someone familiar walking by. Kevin, a friend from his school days. They greeted each other warmly and decided to sit down and talk. When Kevin asked how life was going, Bennett offered a short overview. Work was consistent, home life uneventful, and Kira was out with Sophie. That's when Kevin's demeanor changed. His hand tightened around the napkin, and his face went still. "Sophie?" he said. "She's in London. Just landed a new job. I spoke to her yesterday." Something inside Bennett shifted, quiet but undeniable. He forced a mild smile, though something low and unsettling had begun to stir in his chest. Not loud enough to take over, but impossible to ignore. He gently redirected the conversation, thanked Kevin, and left sooner than planned. Once in his car, he sat motionless, the engine running, headlights glowing faintly, not yet ready to drive. The contradictions spun in his head like mismatched puzzle pieces. Sophie was abroad. Kira had said she was meeting her. The story didn't add up. He tried to explain it away. Maybe it was another friend with the same name, or perhaps he'd misunderstood. But in his heart, he knew there was only one Sophie that Kira ever mentioned. The dress, the heels, the kiss on the forehead, they had all seemed harmless. Until now. Around 11 that night, he heard the door open. Kira tiptoed in barefoot, holding her shoes in one hand. Bennett was still on the couch, eyes facing the television, though his mind was elsewhere. She smiled like someone coming home from a perfectly normal evening. She tossed her purse on the side table, dropped her shoes by the wall, and launched into casual chatter. Said the food had been underwhelming, that Sophie had exciting news to share, and they'd lost track of time catching up. Her tone was light, her body language loose, as though everything she described was routine. Bennett gave a soft, nonchalant, No accusation, no edge. His tone was steady, stripped of emotion, as if testing the limits of silence. Perhaps comforted by his calm, Kira kept talking, complained about the crowded restaurant, the heavy traffic, even passed along Sophie's greetings. He simply nodded, reached for the remote, and raised the volume. Kira hovered nearby, sneaking glances at him, maybe waiting for a question or a reaction. But he said nothing, still, quiet, like someone rewatching a story they already knew too well. Inside, every sentence she spoke registered like a pin dropped on a map. Outwardly, he remained composed, but within, something had begun to crystallize, a plan that no longer included her at the center. Later that night, while Kira lay asleep beside him, Bennett stayed on the couch, eyes tracing the ceiling, mind sharpening into quiet resolve. He wasn't angry, he was preparing. The next morning, Bennett lay in bed for a while, staring upwards, scenes from the previous night playing in fragments. He could hear Kira humming in the other room as she got dressed for work, as if nothing had changed. He put on his clothes, smoothed his hair, and left the apartment, face unreadable. But underneath, the calm was gone. A new purpose had taken its place. He wouldn't rest until he knew the truth. The following day, he waited for a moment when Kira had left her phone charging on the kitchen counter, something she did without thinking. Quietly, and with the precision of someone who understood how systems worked, Bennett installed a small tracking app. Nothing aggressive, just a tool to confirm facts when words became unreliable. He sipped his coffee, kissed her on the cheek, wished her a good day, and headed out like everything was ordinary. Over the next few days, he observed, he logged her movements, noted her explanations, and checked them against reality. When she said she was staying late at work, the tracking confirmed she was exactly where she claimed. But by Friday, the pieces started falling into place. Kira casually mentioned that she had an important meeting scheduled for later and might grab a drink with co-workers afterward. Bennett gave a calm, measured response. There was a quiet distance in his voice, as though he'd already mapped out the ending, yet chose to stay until the final lines played out. After a moment of silence, he opened the location tracking app. His eyes followed the moving dot as it wound through quiet neighborhoods, far from any corporate address. The signal came to a stop on a serene, residential street lined with modest houses and minimal activity. Bennett parked his car a few blocks away and continued on foot. Across the road, he saw her, Kira, step out of a vehicle beside a man. Together, they walked into a home. She was laughing, an easy, uninhibited laugh he hadn't heard from her in what felt like years. Her face lit up with a freedom he no longer saw when she looked at him. He stood motionless on the sidewalk and raised his phone to capture a few images. The moment wasn't overtly incriminating, yet the implications were impossible for him to ignore. He stayed there for a while, watching silently. She seemed happy, just not with him. Nearly 10 years of shared life felt as though it had quietly unraveled on an unremarkable street he'd never been to before. He drew a long breath and made his way back to the car. Bennett started the engine but didn't drive off. He stared at his own reflection in the rearview mirror, frozen for what felt like a lifetime. No tears came. Instead, he processed. He measured. What he had seen was sufficient, clear. She had chosen deceit. Later that evening, back at their home, he sat at his desk and powered up his laptop. Without a word, he began designing his exit. His first step was to browse modest apartments in quiet neighborhoods. Nothing flashy, just something small and private, enough to restart. He saved 2 listings and scheduled viewings for the next day. Then came the money, minor transfers from their joint account into one only he had access to. The amounts were small, insignificant on the surface, unlikely to trigger any suspicion. He moved on to gathering personal records, passports, birth certificates, legal documents, and compiled them into a single folder. Sorting through storage boxes, he discarded whatever felt obsolete. It was as though he were clearing away debris to make space for something new. As he let go of the remnants of their shared life, he experienced a strange calm. That night, Kira returned late. She claimed the meeting had run long, then went on about her boss and a new employee who wouldn't stop talking. Bennett listened closely, nodded in the right places, asked just enough questions to keep her unaware. She eventually went to bed, none the wiser. He stayed awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, contemplating his next steps. It wasn't about envy anymore. It wasn't even about being wronged. It was about self-worth, about declining to accept affection that came with conditions or disguises. He didn't want to argue. He didn't need a dramatic finale. He wanted a clean, quiet end. Over the next several days, he wrapped things up. He visited both apartments and chose the second, modest, well-lit, with a parking space and walking distance to a train station. He paid for the first 2 months in full. He began relocating his belongings gradually, whenever Kira wasn't home. A few clothes, some books, the bare necessities. He submitted notice on their rented home. His name was on the lease. The landlord processed it without hesitation. Everything unfolded just as he'd designed. With each small move, Bennett felt a little lighter. There was no hesitation left. The reality had made itself known, and he'd acted accordingly. Now it was just follow-through, like repairing electronics at work. Identify the broken component, remove it, replace it. This time, the faulty piece was his life with Kira. On the morning he had chosen, Bennett woke before the sun. He got dressed quietly, pulling on yesterday's pants from the chair, and walked to the kitchen to make himself a simple cup of coffee. Kira still slept, turned slightly away, as if nothing in their world had changed. But for him, everything had. The structure was complete, the future outlined. The new apartment was ready. His things were already there. The finances were separated, the lease was ending, and the move was scheduled. After finishing his coffee, he took a deep breath and retrieved the envelope he had prepared the night before. He placed it neatly on the kitchen table. Inside were the photos he'd taken, the lease termination letter, his house key, and the ring he'd worn more out of obligation than devotion. The weight of the gesture didn't shake him. The choice was no longer about emotion. It was methodical, intentional, a decision made in full clarity. Since they'd never legalized their relationship, there were no court dates, no legal battles, just a quiet, complete ending, sealed behind closed doors. With only a backpack carrying a few changes of clothes, he left through the front door with the composure of someone who had finally chosen honesty over pretense. Driving toward his new apartment, Bennett felt no desire to look back, no lingering dread. Everything that needed to be said had been expressed in silence. The car's quiet hum matched the stillness within him. When he arrived, he stepped inside, locked the door, dropped the bag on the floor, and sat down. The space didn't ask for explanations. It simply existed, and now it was his. Hours later, Kira woke alone. She reached for Bennett, but her hand touched only cold sheets. She rose slowly, expecting to find him in the kitchen, brewing the first pot of coffee, or maybe having ducked out for a quick errand. As she drifted through the house, still half lost in sleep, a strange tension clung to the air. Everything looked normal, untouched, but the stillness felt different, heavier. She called Bennett's name twice. Silence. Stepping back into the bedroom, she stopped cold in front of the open closet. Only half his things remained. Her chest tightened. She rushed to the kitchen, heart racing. On the table sat an envelope, waiting like a final word. Her fingers shook as she tore it open. Every item inside hit like a blow, a formal lease cancellation. Candid photos, clearly taken from a distance, of her and another man entering a house she didn't recognize. And at the bottom, a ring. Simple, silent, damning. It said more than shouting ever could. She sank into a chair, frozen. Minutes passed before she moved again. Finally, she reached for her phone and tried calling, straight to voicemail. She typed out message after message, each one overflowing with regret, then deleted every word. She called again and again. 4 tries, no answer. Restless, she roamed the rooms, each one feeling like it held a secret waiting to explode. At last, she dialed her lover. Her voice cracked as she confessed. Bennett knew. He was gone. She begged for comfort. His reply was hesitant, evasive. He mentioned responsibilities, reminded her, gently, that what they had wasn't built for permanence. The conversation ended quickly. He didn't ask if she was okay. Kira crumpled to the floor, right there in the living room. The next morning, she messaged a co-worker she'd had drinks with once or twice. She told the truth, barely, and asked for a place to stay, just for a few nights. The answer came kindly, but firmly. The timing was bad. The house was crowded. They wished her the best, hoped she'd land on her feet. Another door quietly shut. Her thoughts spiraled. She began searching online, looking for anywhere she could afford. Her parents lived far away, and they'd never been close. With few options, she filtered for cheap apartments and found one. It was run down, but within her means. A week later, she crammed what she could into her car. Clothes stuffed in tote bags, essentials boxed in whatever containers she could find. The new apartment was just a few blocks from work, tucked in a crumbling complex with flickering hallway lights and peeling walls. She carried everything herself. No one came to help. No one even noticed. Inside, the paint flaked from the corners, and the floor felt permanently stained. She let her bags fall into a corner and sat on the bare floor. Looking up at the ceiling, she tried to comprehend how quickly her life had unraveled. She checked her phone again. Still nothing from Bennett. Her fingers hovered over the screen, thinking of one more message, but she didn't send it. In the days that followed, she went through the motions, but nothing felt real. The places they'd shared, restaurants, cafes, parks, now felt miles out of reach. Dinner became microwaved meals eaten in silence. At work, she wore a mask of composure, but the whispers had already spread. Everyone knew. There was nothing left to explain. Her new home reminded her constantly of what she'd thrown away. And though Bennett hadn't said a word, his silence spoke volumes. She understood. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment across town, Bennett felt something loosen inside him. It wasn't fancy, but it was his. The quiet no longer felt oppressive. It was a balm. He filled the space with only the basics: a bed, a small stove, a folding table. The walls stayed bare, no keepsakes, no ghosts. His phone, now silent, rested untouched. The first few nights were strange, unfamiliar, but not painful. He started waking early, savoring the calm. He cooked, walked, read books left untouched for years. For the first time in ages, he didn't have to explain himself or pretend to be okay. His silence had already said everything. Slowly, he began to smile again, not the forced kind, real, quiet ones. At work, he stayed steady, clear-headed. It felt like turning the first page of something new. Kira, meanwhile, tried to rebuild a life from the pieces. Her apartment echoed with memories of what used to be. Each familiar place she passed reopened old wounds. Occasionally, she reached out, spaced messages, cautiously hopeful. She said she missed him, that she'd lost sight of things, that she hadn't meant for it all to spiral like this. But he never replied. The silence remained. Eventually, she began to grasp the truth. Some choices carry heavier consequences than they seem. Some losses come without explanation and stay that way. One quiet Saturday, a knock came at Bennett's door. His new neighbor needed help installing a water heater. Bennett spent the afternoon adjusting pipes, tightening valves. When they were done, the neighbor handed him a beer, and they sat on folding chairs, talking until the sky went dark. Bennett shared parts of his story, without anger, without self-pity. He said simply, "Starting over is hard, but sometimes it's the only way to live again." Later, back in his apartment, Bennett looked around. The space still echoed with quiet, but it felt lighter now. The hurt had faded. The love was gone. But what remained, his dignity, had seen him through. And in the end, that made all the difference.